All right, we are live.
Welcome to our media availability. This is our first day, and welcome to all our media. There's some new faces there, some that we recognize. Maybe if I could just have the media go around and introduce themselves for our benefit. I'll start.
Lisa Riley Roche, Deseret News Case Health.
I'm Catherine Taylor. I'm from UPR.
Okay.
Nicole Nixon with KUER.
All right.
Brian Schott, UtahPolicy.com.
And
Preston Cathcart, intern at the Deseret News.
great. Any more? Anybody else? For those who are watching, you can go ahead and through all the avenues that we have, send in your questions, and we look forward to answering them in the weeks ahead. And I'll turn the time over to our media members here for any questions or comments.
The House Speaker today spoke about fears that the legislature might lose their impact because you're a part-time legislature. He talked about the need to stay vigilant, kind of a rallying cry over there. Do you have concerns that the legislature may lose impact, or?
Well, I'm not sure what the context of that statement is, but the biggest concern I have is not the impact that we have here in the state of Utah. It's the impact that we have in the jurisdiction that has been relevant and our jurisdiction for many years, which has been the creep of the federal government into our jurisdiction in many respects that brings me great concern. And looking and seeing what has happened here recently with the government shutdown in Washington, D.C., under both the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, it appears to me that these things would probably be better addressed here, and we can address them better without shutdowns and meltdowns and whatever happens. And so I really, if that's even part of the context, I would agree with that 100%. And I'm hoping that either the states can rise up and clip the wings of the federal government, or they do it on their own. They haven't had much success with them doing it on their own. Any other?
We would never let our national parks close. When you have an economy in those rural communities that is basically dependent upon those few resources they have around those national parks, it's economic disaster for them. And tourism is a fundamental part of our economy here. So when they closed last time, we funded them. I'm not sure if the federal government's ever paid us back, but we wouldn't let them close. And the reason we wouldn't do it again is because exactly what the president talked about is that we're closer to those economies and we're closer to the people. I think we have a vested interest, a very significant vested interest in making sure that those services stay available.
Yeah, let me just tell you a brief story, since we probably have a little time today. It's maybe a little bit slower on issues, but I was asked to testify before Congress last April on unfunded mandates. I was asked to represent the Council of State Governments, CSG. I prepared my remarks because it was required to testify before Congress. So I had to write them all down, and they had to be within a 5-minute period. And I had to send them to the committee. I got a call from the Democratic staff of the committee and asked me a lot of questions about my testimony. And I got a call from the Republican staff members who asked me a lot of things. And then the day came. A little nervous, went in there. I'm one of 5, 2 legislators, 2 county elected officials, and a city official there to testify about unfunded mandates. Well, it's a committee of 18. It was a subcommittee of the Oversight Committee, and 3 of the members were there. the chair, the minority leader, and the vice chair. And then once in a while, you'd have one of the other members come in for just a minute, and then they'd leave. Well, we gave our scripted remarks, and then they asked us scripted questions that they had already scripted. We scripted, they scripted, and then the meeting ended. And we talked to a maximum of 3 or 4 House of Representative members at any one given time. Now I contrast that with what happens in Utah. Any person of any mind walks off the street and into a committee hearing here in Utah, and in the public comment period can say what they want as long as it's civil, and we respond to them unscriptedly. Where do you want public policy to be driven? People want to have public policy driven where they have a voice. And you have more of a voice as citizens in this state capitol or in the city hall than you do in Washington, D.C. And that's why we here are able to make better policy for the people of the state of Utah and not in our federal government. Further questions? Brian? Anything?
Okay, there's been a lot of talk about tax reform, but I haven't really heard any solid, specific ideas. What do you want to accomplish?
I'd like to lower the rate and broaden the base.
Okay, you've said that, but specifically, how do you want to get there?
We don't know where we're gonna go until we figure out what the revenue is going to be from the federal tax reform, and where, like, the pass-through entity income is gonna end up below the so-called line or above the so-called line. That's gonna drive a lot of what we're able to do during this session. And so until we know that, I think that we would look at what the federal government did, where you kind of diminish some of the loopholes, some of the exemptions, some of the deductions, and lower the rate for everybody. That would be, I think, our objective also, to do what they have done, and what they did in 1986, and what they did in 1981. Those were broadening the base and lowering the rates, and I'd like to take on a similar course for the legislature this year.
So if you're waiting to see what's going to happen with federal tax reform, are you going to have enough time? I remember this came up late in the session last time, and you just ran out of time to get anything done. So are you going to have enough time this year if you're waiting to see what happens?
We'll know this week where the revenue is going to be, and then I think that will drive a lot of what we do.
If I could chime in, I talked to somebody this morning, and I was right on the range. I said, we've got a heck of a range to work with. It's between 20 and about $85 million that we think will be impacted. But I think we have Commissioner Valentine coming in to talk to us at EAC on Thursday, and they will have a much better idea by then. And those numbers that's what we're going with right now.
So we do have probably a lot of motivations to do some tax reform that we didn't have last year. One is that the federal tax reform that happened and the effect it has. But we have an initiative going on for education, and great respect for those that put forth the initiative. But I think many of us believe, as well-meaning as that is, that it's better policy for us to deal with those issues here. When we come up with an idea, and you've seen us do it, you saw us do it last year, and you've seen us do it before, as we come up with our individual ideas, they seem to be refined by 100 other 3 people who think differently than we do. And by the time we get through the process, our idea usually is a lot better idea at the end than it was when we started. And the initiative processes don't have that ability. They start and they aren't necessarily refined. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of, what can I say, not pressure, but at least reasons for us to deal with tax reforms that didn't exist last year. So whether we get there, I don't know, but I think there's surely a reason to do it.
it's difficult for us to do this, there's no question about it, as we've seen last year, but we didn't have the federal reform to actually piggyback off of it. And so this is the opportunity of several decades to actually do something.
On tax reform, if you don't mind, isn't the issue that you have not enough sales tax revenue, and so you're not necessarily, you don't need to worry as much about tweaking the income tax numbers. Your sales tax isn't keeping up the pace, and even though you tried to do the online sales tax, that keeps getting shot down. There's a Supreme Court case, I guess they're gonna hear later this year on that issue, maybe give you a little bit more latitude, but right now, what are you gonna do to sales tax? I mean, and as the governor's mentioned, taxing services, expanding the services that are taxed. Is that,
There's no question that the base of the sales tax has its struggles. And so we attempted to put the sales tax back on food last year. But while it would broaden the base, it really didn't have the impact that we had once thought. And yes, online sales tax is an issue, and hopefully we might get some action out of the Supreme Court, because we haven't been able to get any action out of Congress on that issue. But more, by far, the biggest problem in the general fund is we spend $600 million of it on transportation. That's the problem. That's the problem of the last almost 2 decades. And that's what we need to focus on and try to address in this legislature and legislature going forward, because transportation is a big part of our infrastructure. We're all experiencing now congestion that we haven't felt for many years, or I don't know if we've ever felt like we're feeling it now. And we've just invested billions of dollars in highways over the last couple of years. So those are the challenges that growth. But if we could put $600 million back in the general fund, problem solved for many years to come.
which means that you have to look at the gas tax and the tolls or fees for.
Those are
hybrid
discussions that we're gonna have, it's an unpopular thing to talk about. But those are issues that we, as legislators, are faced with and have to make some tough decisions with going forward.
But you can't get anywhere near $600 million from a gas tax increase or electric car or bikes, right?
Politically, no, you're right. So, but
Not even totally.
we've got, I think that within the next 10 years, you're gonna have 10 to 20% of your vehicles on the road that are non-gas. And at that point, the gas tax, we have to look deeply and say, this is maybe an obsolete tax, as that margin even gets larger with electric cars or hydrogen or whatever's going to come in the next 10 years. And we've got to figure out a way to do that. And vehicle miles driven, tolling, or something somebody's never thought of, we'll need we'll have to look at those issues to address that problem. It's a huge, huge problem coming on us, and I hope we can be more proactive. Senator Davis is here from the minority party. Have you talked about tax reform or anything in your caucus?
We have, and our interest has been, during the interim, the tax committee met, and the interim tax committee. And their idea was we would find reform, we would find some of the deductions that we'd do away with. We continue to talk about sales tax on food. But as I understand, the committee found no exemptions that were worthy of doing away with. And that would give us more. We have to take a look at what we're giving away. And it would be great, I think, if we looked at some of these exemptions, not to do away with them entirely, but we did them on percentages, based upon some economic good that they're doing. And you reward those tax exemptions with jobs. You reward them with a percentage, and only a percentage. Because if we had half of those exemptions being paid for, just at 50%, it would take care of those needs. So those are the things we need to start thinking about how we do reform. We realize as we're growing as a state that being revenue neutral on everything is not the answer. We have to find new revenue to be able to address our growing needs in the state. With transportation, we need to find the money to be able to identify and address those issues. Education becomes primary also, because we know with more children, the technology that children are learning, their learning curve is a very important part of how we deal with that tax infrastructure that we have and how we relegate that to get the best bang for our buck. And I think we've come to a conclusion now that it's not throwing rocks at the education system. I think it's understanding what that system is, what that system needs, so we can begin to move forward.
Any other questions?
So is it safe to assume that's where a lot of the, when we're talking about the initiatives for education and we're talking about the 600 million for transportation, and you talk about tax reform being focused on lowering the rate, then any additional revenue for education, we're looking at transportation, that's $600 million. Recouping that, and that would go toward education, is that a safe bet?
Yeah, and knowing the history of that dynamic where the legislature has effectively been able to move education money out of the education fund to higher education, because traditionally higher education was funded out of the general fund. And then with the constitutional amendment in 1996, I believe, that higher ed now could be funded out of the education fund, which allowed us now to free up that general fund money, paying for higher education with education funds, and moving general fund money over to transportation. And that grew and ballooned to $600 million today. So that's in a nutshell, that's our challenge.
And we thought we were going to have enough money in the flat tax idea of 5%. However, that 5% is really not a 5% tax. The effective rate now of our flat tax is 3.8%. So that's another place where you're losing money, really, into the education system.
But that's because of your personal exemption, your standard deductions, and your Schedule A deductions.
It may take a combination as you look at maybe those funds we talked about, but Senator Osmond ran a bill a few years ago that allowed the property tax to inflate and then actually to use those inflated property taxes to equalize. And Senator Fillmore's been running something similar to that. And that bill came very close to passing last session, and I think that's maybe an option too to raise some funds. And you may not be able to do it with one solution, but it may take a combination. And that's, I think, the beauty of the legislative process is we'll look at underneath all the rocks we possibly can, and if you have a few you want us to look underneath, tell us about it. We'd like to go find them and find out if there isn't some combination that works.
At the same time, we have to respect our local school districts in that property tax funding, that we don't rob from them. And when I say rob from them, there's a lot of voters who went to the polls and voted for increased property taxes in those various school districts. And we have to make sure that we don't erode that base from what the people really wanted in those districts. So it's complicated. You should take a look. It's like pushing on a full balloon. You push on one side and it inflates more pressure on the other side. And it's really taking this ball and figuring out how we're going to do that. And quite frankly, we've been very, very successful as a state in 45 days to be able to address a lot of problems of state and find good positive solutions.
Any questions from our viewers?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, then thank you. And Senator Rulis, or Escamilla, it's good to see you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. And we'll see you all tomorrow after wartime. Thank you.
So I used to say, same time, same station.
Only 32 more.